Case 1. Scott Peterson. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Laci Peterson was 8 months pregnant and mopping the kitchen floor of her home on Covina Avenue in Modesto, California. She was 27 years old. Her husband Scott was getting ready to leave. The baby was due in February. They had already picked the name, Connor. The nursery was set up. The couple had been married since August 9, 1997, after meeting at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in 1994. Laci had worked as a substitute teacher. Scott sold agricultural fertilizer and travelled regularly across Central California. They had moved to Modesto in 2000, bought the house on Covina Avenue, and settled into the neighbourhood. Their golden retriever, Mackenzie, needed a walk. Christmas dinner was planned at her mother Sharon Roach's house that evening. Scott's work required regular travel across Central California, and Laci had settled into a routine built around the pregnancy. She attended prenatal appointments, shopped for baby supplies, and told friends she was excited and exhausted in equal measure. They had been together for 8 years. Neighbours on Covina Avenue described them as pleasant and unremarkable, a young couple doing what young couples in Modesto did. The ordinariness was the point. What happened next only carries weight because the life that preceded it felt so completely normal. Scott had played golf competitively in high school and attended Arizona State University before transferring to Cal Poly. His background was conventional: a middle-class upbringing in San Diego, the youngest of 6 children, a college degree, a career in sales. Nothing in his documented history before November 2002 pointed toward what would follow. The absence of prior criminal behaviour or violence made the case harder for observers to understand and easier for the defence to argue. Laci's mother Sharon would later describe the last time she saw her daughter, at a Christmas party just days before the disappearance, as a perfectly ordinary family gathering. Laci was tired from the pregnancy, but excited about the holiday. She talked about what she wanted to cook for Christmas dinner. She talked about Connor. The normalcy of that final interaction became, in the months that followed, one of the hardest details for Sharon to reconcile with what happened next. The pregnancy had given the couple a shared project, a future they talked about in public and planned for in private. Laci's friends later described her excitement about becoming a mother. She had opinions about paediatricians, about feeding schedules, about the kind of parent she wanted to be. Scott participated in these conversations. He attended appointments. He helped assemble the crib. From the perspective of everyone around them, including Laci, the pregnancy was bringing them closer together. The reality was the opposite. While Laci planned for Connor's arrival, Scott was building a relationship with another woman and buying a boat he would hide in a warehouse. 2 timelines were running simultaneously, one visible, one concealed, and they were about to collide. Amber Fry would later testify that Scott had been attentive, affectionate, and convincing throughout their relationship. He had created a complete alternate identity, a version of himself that was unmarried, childless, and grieving. The construction of that identity required sustained effort and consistent detail. He remembered the lies he had told. He built on them in subsequent conversations. He responded to Amber's emotions with the appropriate reactions of a man living the life he had described. The sophistication of the deception was, for prosecutors, evidence of the kind of mind that could plan and carry out what came next. By that night, Laci would be reported missing. By April, her body and the body of her unborn son would be recovered from the San Francisco Bay. The location would match the one place Scott claimed to have been on December 24th. But the lies did not start on December 24th. They started weeks earlier, with a woman named Amber, a boat no one knew about, and a story about being a widower. In November 2002, 1 month before Laci disappeared, Scott Peterson began a relationship with a massage therapist named Amber Fry. He had been introduced to her through a mutual friend. From the first conversation, he lied. He told her he was a widower, not separated, not complicated. He said his wife was dead. Amber believed him. She was dating a man who, as far as she knew, was grieving the loss of his spouse. On December 9, 2002, Scott told Amber that the approaching holidays would be his first Christmas without his wife. That same day, while building this fiction of widowed grief, he drove to a dealership and bought a 14-foot aluminium fishing boat for $1,400 in cash. He did not tell Laci. He did not tell her family. He stored the boat at a warehouse connected to his work, in a space that existed completely outside the life he shared with his pregnant wife. The boat was invisible to everyone in his family. It was also the vessel prosecutors would later argue he used to dump Laci's body into the San Francisco Bay. The secrecy of the boat purchase was one of the prosecution's strongest arguments for planning. A fishing trip does not require secrecy. A man who buys a boat to go fishing tells his wife. A man who buys a boat for the purpose the prosecution alleged does not. The cash payment, the separate storage location, the absence of any mention to Laci or her family, all of it pointed to a purchase made with a specific, concealed purpose. The recordings that Amber Fry would later make for police revealed something beyond the content of Scott's lies. They captured the ease with which he delivered them. His tone was warm, his expressions of affection sounded genuine, his fabricated grief was convincing. Prosecutors would argue that this capacity for sustained, elaborate deception, maintained over weeks, across dozens of conversations, without a single break in character, was directly relevant to the question at the centre of the case: whether Scott Peterson was capable of the calculated planning that the crime required. 2 weeks after buying that boat in secret and telling another woman he was a widower, Scott Peterson's pregnant wife vanished on Christmas Eve. According to Scott, he left the house around 10:08 a.m. to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, 90 miles west in the San Francisco Bay. He said he was targeting sturgeon. The weather was cold with light rain, conditions that made it unusual for a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy to walk a dog outdoors. But Scott's account suggested that was Laci's plan. She was going to take Mackenzie to the park while he was gone. A parking receipt at the Berkeley Marina timestamped 12:54 p.m. confirmed Scott's vehicle had been there. It could not confirm what he brought on the boat or what he did on the water. He returned home around 2:15 p.m. He said Laci was not there, but the timeline already had a problem. A neighbour had found Mackenzie wandering the neighbourhood with the leash still attached and returned the dog to the Petersons' backyard. This happened before Scott reported Laci missing. If Laci had been walking the dog and been abducted, the dog's return did not align with when Scott claimed he first noticed his wife was gone. At 5:47 p.m, Sharon Rocher called the police. Within hours, the Modesto Police Department launched a full-scale search. Volunteers organised across the city. Flyers bearing Laci's photograph went up in every window. The case hit local news that night and national networks within days. Laci was young, visibly pregnant, and had vanished on Christmas Eve. The baby shower was still on the calendar. The nursery was still waiting. The country paid attention. Modesto had not experienced anything like this before. The disappearance of a pregnant woman on Christmas Eve created an emotional urgency that mobilised people who had no personal connection to the family. Churches opened their doors for coordination. Local businesses printed flyers for free. The search expanded from neighbourhoods to parks to waterways within days, driven by a community that believed it was racing against time to bring Laci home alive. The search for Laci Peterson became the kind of case that defines an era of media coverage. Her face was on every network. Volunteers who had never visited Modesto drove hours to join search teams. Reward funds were established. Community organisations coordinated daily efforts that stretched across Stanislaus County and into the surrounding Central Valley. The emotional weight of the story, a pregnant woman gone on Christmas Eve, was sufficient to turn a local missing person case into a national obsession within days. Scott participated in early search efforts. He was present at coordination points. He answered questions from investigators. But even in those first days, his demeanour registered with the people around him. Volunteers later described a man who seemed unusually composed for someone whose pregnant wife had vanished. The emotional evenness that might have read as strength in another context began to feel, to the people watching closely, like something else entirely. His calm never cracked. Not during the search, not during the interviews, not during the vigils. People who had volunteered their time to find Laci began to notice that the husband at the centre of the crisis seemed less affected by it than the strangers helping him. It was not evidence, but it was the beginning of doubt. Investigators would later note that Scott never searched in the area of the Berkeley Marina, the one location that, if his story about fishing was true, would have been the logical place to look for someone who might have harmed Laci. He searched neighbourhoods. He answered phones. but he never once suggested that the area where he had been on December 24th might hold answers. That omission did not go unnoticed, and then Scott Peterson stepped in front of the cameras. On December 31st, 2002, a candlelight vigil was held for Laci in Modesto. Hundreds of people gathered. Scott attended. Photographs from that night show him smiling at a gathering meant to express grief for his missing pregnant wife. Witnesses reported he spent portions of the vigil whispering into his cell phone. It was later revealed that the person on the other end of those calls was Amber Fry. While a community held candles and prayed for Laci's return, Scott was talking to the woman he had told he was a widower. He gave formal media interviews. He appeared on Dateline, NBC, and other programs. He publicly asked for Laci's safe return. His tone throughout was calm, measured, and composed. No tears, no visible desperation, no emotional fracture of any kind. He looked and sounded like a man giving a business presentation, not a husband whose pregnant wife had vanished without explanation. During one recorded call with Amber, Scott said he was calling from Paris, France. He was not in Paris. He was in Modesto, at a vigil for his missing wife. That lie was later played in court. But the most important thing about his television appearances was that Amber saw him on the news, recognized him, called police, and agreed to record every future conversation. His decision to face cameras created the evidence that helped convict him. For 4 months, the case went unresolved. Then the San Francisco Bay gave back what had been put into it. Investigators searched the warehouse where Scott stored his boat. Inside, they found remnants of homemade concrete anchors. Only one anchor was recovered intact. If multiple had been made but only one remained, the prosecution argued the others were at the bottom of the bay, used as weights. Investigators examined tidal patterns, water temperature data, and environmental conditions to determine whether the body recovery location was consistent with entry near the Berkeley Marina. The ocean current analysis supported the prosecution theory. The bay had carried the remains from the area where Scott said he had been fishing to the shoreline where they washed up 4 months later. The absence of a definitive cause of death, the condition of the remains had advanced too far, was a challenge for prosecutors. But the geographic evidence was overwhelming. The odds of Laci's body appearing at the precise location where her husband claimed to have been fishing were, in practical terms, 0. On April 13, 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci disappeared, the remains of a male infant washed ashore near the Richmond shoreline in the San Francisco Bay Area. The following day, the torso of an adult female was found nearby. Forensic analysis identified the remains as Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The location was near the Berkeley Marina, the exact spot where Scott told police he had gone fishing on December 24th. The medical examiner could not determine the exact cause of death due to the condition of the remains, but the geographic match between Scott's stated alibi and where his wife's body was recovered was the single strongest piece of indirect evidence in the case. 5 days later, police found Scott in La Jolla, California, 30 miles from the Mexican border. His hair was dyed blonde. He was carrying $15,000 in cash, camping equipment, multiple cell phones, and his brother's driver's license instead of his own. The arrest transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a criminal prosecution. The trial was moved to San Mateo County due to pre-trial publicity and lasted 5 months, featuring testimony from more than 100 witnesses. Amber Fry took the stand and described the relationship Scott had initiated while his wife was alive and pregnant. The recordings were played for the jury, and the courtroom listened to Scott construct a fictional life in real time, lying with warmth and consistency to a woman who believed she was dating a widower. The defense argued that the prosecution had no cause of death, no direct physical evidence, and that a neighborhood burglary offered an alternative explanation. But the affair, the boat, the anchors, the disguise, the cash, and the geographic match were too much for the jury to dismiss. On November 12, 2004, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree charges for Laci and second-degree charges for Connor. He was sentenced to death. That sentence was overturned in 2020 due to errors in jury selection. In 2021, he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial had lasted 5 months. More than 100 witnesses had testified. The jury weighed the recordings, the geographic match, the timeline problems, the disguise and cash found at the time of arrest, and the pattern of lies that had defined Scott Peterson's behaviour from the first day Laci went missing. The verdict arrived almost 2 years after the crime. 2 years during which Sharon Rocha and the rest of Laci's family had waited for a measure of accountability. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. Connor never took a breath. The nursery on Covenant Avenue was never used. Sharon Rocha lost her daughter and her grandson on the same Christmas Eve, and then spent months watching her son-in-law smile on camera and whisper to his girlfriend at vigils. The media significance of the case has been discussed for 2 decades, but for the people who loved Laci, the analysis has always been secondary to the simple, permanent fact of what was taken and who took it. The Peterson case also demonstrated how televised appearances by a suspect can generate the very evidence that leads to their conviction. Scott chose to be on camera. That choice directly caused Amber Fry to recognise him. Her cooperation produced the recorded calls. The calls provided some of the most damaging prosecution evidence. Every link in that chain started with a decision Scott made freely, to put his face on television while his pregnant wife was missing. It was a miscalculation that altered the course of the investigation and ultimately contributed to the verdict that sent him to prison for the rest of his life. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. Scott Peterson maintained his lie for months before anyone found the truth, but the next husband's televised deception collapsed in less than 48 hours, making his performance one of the shortest lived in criminal history. Case 2. Chris Watts. On the evening of August 12, 2018, Shanann Watts was on a flight home from a business trip in Arizona. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a boy she and her husband Chris had already named Nico. Their 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, called Cece, were at home in Frederick, Colorado, a growing suburb northeast of Denver. Chris had been alone with the girls for several days. Shanann sold health and wellness products through a multi-level marketing company. Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, visiting remote oil well sites across the Colorado Front Range. They had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, but appeared to have rebuilt. On social media, they looked like what they were supposed to be, a young family with a new house, 2 small children, and a baby on the way. The family had moved to Frederick in 2013, buying a house in a new development that represented the life they were building together. Shanann documented everything on social media: the girls' milestones, family dinners, holiday celebrations, and Chris beside her in photo after photo, smiling. For the thousands of people who followed Shanann online and the neighbours who saw them in the cul-de-sac, there was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The documentation was extensive, hundreds of posts across multiple platforms showing birthday parties, holidays, family dinners, and the everyday moments that made up their life in Frederick. Chris appeared in many of them, smiling beside his wife and daughters, in images that would later be held up against the reality of what he did. The social media record became both a memorial to the family that existed and evidence of the lie that concealed its destruction. But the financial strain from the 2015 bankruptcy had never fully resolved, and by the summer of 2018, the marriage was under pressure that went deeper than money. Friends of Shanann described a shift in Chris's behaviour that had become impossible to ignore: the emotional withdrawal, the physical transformation, the growing distance that Shanann discussed with increasing alarm in the weeks before her death. The text messages between Shanann and her friends in the final weeks of her life documented the unravelling of her marriage in real time. She wrote about Chris's coldness, about his refusal to engage with the pregnancy, about the feeling that the man she had married had been replaced by someone she no longer recognised. She tried counselling, she tried communication, she tried giving him space. Nothing worked, because the problem was not something that could be fixed with effort or patience. The problem was that Chris Watts had already decided he was done, and the question was no longer whether he would leave his family, but how. The gap between the social media image and the crime was the documentary's central subject. Shanann had posted about her family hours before she was killed. The photographs of smiling children, of a husband and wife posed together, of birthday parties and family outings, all of it existed in permanent digital form, alongside the doorbell footage of Shanann walking through her front door for the last time. The contrast was not commentary, it was simply what the evidence showed. Two realities running in parallel until one of them ended the other. The case generated discussion about the role of social media in shaping perceptions of family life and the dangers of mistaking curated images for reality. Shanann's online presence had documented the ordinary beauty of her family, but it had also documented the early signs of the fracture, visible in hindsight through the text messages and posts that recorded her growing concern about Chris's behaviour. The digital record preserved both the family's public image and its private disintegration in a way that had not been possible before the age of smartphones and social media. Everything was recorded, everything was recoverable, and everything was eventually used as evidence. For investigators, the digital footprint left by the Watts family provided an evidence-based landscape that would not have existed a decade earlier. Text messages between Chris and Nicole Kessinger documented the affair in granular detail. GPS data from cell phones established Chris's movements on the morning of August 13th. The doorbell camera captured Shanann's arrival. Social media posts established timelines and emotional states. The case became a reference point for how digital evidence can accelerate a homicide investigation and compress the timeline between crime and confession to a matter of hours. Chris Watts told investigators multiple versions of what happened in the early hours of August 13th. Each version revealed more. In his first account, he blamed Shanann. In his second, given months later, he admitted to killing all three. The progression from denial to partial truth to fuller admission followed a pattern investigators had seen before, but the specific details Watts disclosed in his later confessions were among the most disturbing ever documented in a domestic homicide case. The 45 minutes he spent driving to the oil field with his dead wife and living daughters in the vehicle, the sequential nature of the children's deaths, the words his 4-year-old daughter spoke to him before he took her life. These details, delivered by Watts himself, became the defining facts of the case. A friend dropped Shanann off at 1:48 a.m. on August 13th. Doorbell camera footage recorded her walking through the front door. She never walked out again. By sunrise, Shanann, Bella and Celeste were dead. The unborn child she was carrying would never take a single breath. Within 72 hours, Chris Watts would confess. The fracture in the Watts marriage did not happen overnight. It had been widening for months, visible to everyone except the people who might have stopped what came next. In the summer of 2018, Chris Watts was a different person than he had been a year earlier. He had lost weight. He was working out constantly. He had become distant with Shanann, pull away from conversations, spending more time on his phone, less time with the girls. Shanann noticed. She told friends she felt like she was losing him, that something had shifted, that he looked at her differently now. The change in Chris was visible to everyone in Shanann's circle. He had gone from an engaged husband and father to someone who seemed to be counting down the days until he could leave. The weight loss, the gym obsession, the new clothes, all of it pointed to a man who was remaking himself for someone else. Shanann saw the symptoms. She did not know the cause. And by the time the cause became clear, it was too late to change anything. Kessinger later told investigators she had searched for information about Shanann online. She said she did not know the full truth of Chris's family situation until after the crime became public. Whether that account was accurate became a subject of public debate. What was not debated was the timeline. By August 2018, Chris Watts was living two lives, and the one he wanted to keep required the elimination of the one he wanted to leave behind. Investigators later recovered extensive text messages documenting the frequency of contact between Chris and Nicole. The volume showed an emotional departure from his marriage that had been accelerating for weeks. Meanwhile, Shanann was texting friends about her fear that the relationship was failing. She was trying to save something that was already gone, while carrying a child her husband no longer wanted. On August 12th, Shanann boarded a flight home from Arizona. She had no idea she was walking into the last hours of her life. Shanann's flight landed late. A friend drove her home. At 1:48 a.m. on August 13th, 2018, the doorbell camera recorded her entering the house on Saratoga Trail in Frederick. Chris was inside. Bella and Cece were sleeping. What happened between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. has been reconstructed from Chris Watts' confessions. each one revealing more than the last. By mid-morning on August 13th, something was wrong. Shanann missed an obstetrics appointment. She stopped responding to texts. For a woman who communicated constantly, the sudden silence was alarming. A close friend tried to reach her repeatedly, then initiated a welfare check at approximately 12:10 p.m. Police arrived at 1:40 p.m. The house was unlocked. No sign of Shanann or the children. Shanann's purse, keys, phone, and medication were inside. Her car was in the garage with the kids' car seats installed. She had not packed a single item. Every object that would accompany a voluntary departure was still in the house. The welfare check was documented on the responding officer's body camera. Chris Watts appeared outwardly cooperative, answering questions and allowing officers to search the home. But the absence of his entire family, combined with the presence of all their belongings, created a disconnect that officers noted in their reports. A mother and two small children do not leave home in the middle of the night without a vehicle, without a phone, without money, without clothing. Every object told the same story. Whatever happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste happened inside this house. The next morning, Chris Watts stood on his front porch and asked the cameras for help finding his family. On August 14th, 2018, Chris Watts gave live interviews to Colorado stations KMGH-TV and KUSA-TV outside his home. He pleaded for his family's safe return. His voice was steady, his body language was stiff. He used phrases that minimized urgency. He did not cry. Behavioral analysts would later point to his word choices, the direction of his gaze, and the disconnect between what he was saying and how his body was saying it. Journalists who covered the interview noted afterward that Watts spoke about his missing family the way someone might discuss a scheduling conflict, acknowledging the problem without conveying urgency. He described wanting them home, but did not describe fear for their safety. The emotional register was wrong, and the people watching, both in the newsroom and in the audience, sensed it. What made this particular performance unique was how fast it disintegrated. Most suspects in this series maintained their stories for days, weeks, or years. Chris Watts lasted less than 48 hours. Footage from that initial visit became important evidence in its own right. It showed a home where nothing had been packed, where every personal item remained in place, and where a husband walked through the rooms with a steadiness that would later be reinterpreted as the calm of a man who already knew exactly what had happened. On August 15th, investigators administered a polygraph. Watts failed. Under questioning, he began to talk, but his first version was still a lie. He claimed Shanann had harmed Bella and Cece, and that he had acted in response. He wanted investigators to believe he was a father who had acted in grief. The evidence contradicted every part of that account. The real story emerged under further pressure. Chris Watts had ended all 3 lives himself. He took Shanann's life in their bed while she was 15 weeks pregnant. According to his later confession, 4-year-old Bella walked in while he was wrapping her mother in a bedsheet. She asked what was wrong with Mummy. Watts loaded Shanann's body and both living daughters into his work truck. He drove 45 minutes to a remote Anadarko petroleum oil field site, a location he knew intimately from years of employment. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near the storage tanks. Then he ended the lives of Bella and Celeste, individually, one after the other, and pushed their small bodies through 8-inch openings into crude oil tanks. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. During a second confession months later, Watts told investigators that Bella said, "Daddy, no," before he took her life. That drive was not a reaction, it was an execution. He arrived at a site where no one would come looking and disposed of his wife's body. He then did the same to both daughters, separately, one after the other, at a location where no one could hear them. The 8-inch diameter of the oil tank openings became a focal point of public horror, and a detail investigators described as among the most difficult aspects of the recovery. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to 9 charges to avoid the death penalty. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus additional years for tampering with deceased bodies and unlawful termination of a pregnancy. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin for protective custody. The plea deal meant there was no trial. The families of Shanann, Bella and Celeste were spared the ordeal of a courtroom proceeding, but they were also denied the opportunity to confront Chris Watts publicly before a jury. The decision to accept the plea was practical. It guaranteed life imprisonment without the uncertainty of a trial. But for the Rzucek family, the absence of a trial left questions that a courtroom might have answered, not about guilt, which was never in doubt, but about the specific sequence of events in those early morning hours that Chris Watts has described differently in every version he has told. Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door in 2020. The documentary used no narration and no reenactments, only real footage. Doorbell cameras, text messages, social media posts. The televised interview on the porch. Millions watched the gap between the public image and the private reality close in real time. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzucek, lost their daughter, 2 granddaughters, and an unborn grandson in a single night. There are no birthdays that are not shadowed by what happened on August 13th, 2018. 4 lives, and the entire future those lives contained, ended because one man decided his family was standing between him and a woman he had been texting for 2 months. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Chris Watts blamed his dead wife for killing their children, but the next case involves a mother who blamed an imaginary stranger and convinced an entire country to believe her for 9 straight days. Case 3. Susan Smith. In the fall of 1994, Susan Smith was 23 years old and living in Union, South Carolina, a small town where everybody knew everybody. She had 2 sons. Michael was 3, Alexander was 14 months old. She was married to David Smith, she had a job, she drove the boys to daycare. She lived the kind of life that looked from the outside like the life of any other young mother in a small southern town. Michael was learning to talk in full sentences. Alexander was just starting to walk. Susan worked and dropped the boys at daycare. She interacted with neighbours and co-workers in ways that gave no one reason to suspect that her internal life had become unmanageable. Her marriage to David Smith had its problems, but those problems were not visibly different from those faced by many young couples in small-town South Carolina. The absence of any warning sign was part of what made the eventual truth so shattering for the people who thought they knew her. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan drove to a police station and reported that a man had carjacked her vehicle at a red light, with both boys still strapped into their car seats in the back seat. For 9 days, the entire country searched for Michael and Alexander. Susan appeared on national television, sobbing, begging for their return. The boys were already dead. They had been dead since the moment she drove to the police station. She had strapped them into their seats, driven to a boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, released the parking brake and let the car roll into the water with both of her sons inside. The false accusation carried consequences beyond the investigation. Smith described her alleged carjacker as a black man, and that description led to suspicion falling on innocent people. In a country already grappling with racial tension in the criminal justice system, the fabrication of a black suspect by a white woman became a flashpoint for national conversation about race, credibility, and the weaponization of racial stereotypes. Civil rights organizations noted that Smith had relied on assumptions she knew police and the public would accept without question. The racial dimension of the hoax became a lasting element of the case and influenced how future false crime reports involving racial descriptions would be scrutinized. The broader legacy of the Smith case extended beyond the racial dimensions of the false report. The case established a template that would recur in the decades that followed: a parent appearing on camera, crying for a missing child, generating national sympathy and massive search efforts, while concealing direct responsibility for the crime. The emotional power of a parent's public plea proved to be one of the most effective forms of misdirection available to a guilty person. Investigators who worked similar cases in subsequent years cited the Smith case as a reference point for applying early scrutiny to the accounts of those closest to the victim. The sentencing hearing in July 1995 included testimony about the impact of the deaths on the Smith and Rocker families, on the community of Union, and on the law enforcement officers who had spent 9 days searching for children they would later learn had been dead since the night the search began. The emotional toll of the deception extended far beyond the immediate family. Search volunteers, police officers, and community members who had invested their time and grief in a fabricated emergency described a sense of betrayal that persisted for years after the trial ended. But for 9 days, she looked into cameras and cried for children she had already taken from this world, and the country believed every word. The 9-day duration of the deception was itself remarkable. Smith maintained the carjacking story through repeated police interviews, through polygraph sessions, through daily interactions with media and volunteers, and through public appearances that demanded sustained emotional performance. She cried on cue. She answered questions consistently. She played the role of a terrified mother, while knowing that both of her children were at the bottom of a lake, less than 15 miles from where she stood. The community around her had no idea. Volunteers who searched in the rain and cold believed they were looking for kidnapped children. Law enforcement officers who worked 18-hour days believed they were racing against time to save 2 little boys. The emotional toll of the search was real. People were losing sleep, missing work, pouring their energy into an effort driven by a story that had been manufactured from the first word. When the truth emerged, the betrayal was not just personal, it was communal. An entire town had been deceived by one of its own. In the weeks before October 25th, Susan Smith's personal life was disintegrating. She was involved in a romantic relationship outside her marriage, with a man who had made one thing explicitly clear: he did not want to be with a woman who had children. Prosecutors would later argue that Susan came to see Michael and Alexander not as her sons, but as obstacles. The man she wanted had drawn a line. Her children were on the wrong side of it. Smith's behaviour in the days immediately before the crime gave no outward sign of what she was planning. She went to work. She dropped the boys off and picked them up. She spoke with friends and family members in ways that suggested nothing unusual was happening. The internal decision, whatever process led her to drive to that lake on that night, left no visible trace in her daily life. That absence of warning signs became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case for the people who knew her. The description Susan gave was specific: a man in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a toboggan hat, driving away with 2 children strapped into the back seat. Law enforcement distributed the descriptions statewide. Roadblocks were set up on major highways. The FBI joined the investigation. For 9 days, every resource available was directed toward finding a carjacker who did not exist. The scale of the search reflected the emotional weight of what had been reported. Union was a small town. 2 missing children shook it to its core. Neighbours volunteered, churches held vigils, businesses donated supplies to search teams. The emotional investment of an entire community, and eventually an entire nation, was directed by a story that was, from the first word, a complete fabrication. During those 9 days, Susan Smith became one of the most visible figures in American media. She appeared on national television and local news, pleading for the safe return of Michael and Alexander. Her statements were emotional, urgent, and convincing. She spoke as a mother in agony. She described the terror of the carjacking. She begged whoever had taken her boys to bring them home. Her performances were consistent and detailed. She repeated the same narrative: the carjacking, the armed stranger, the helplessness, without variation across multiple interviews and police sessions. The consistency of the story was, in the early days, taken as a sign of credibility. It was only later, when the physical evidence contradicted every element of her account, that the consistency was reinterpreted as rehearsal. The emotional power of a young mother crying on camera for her missing children mobilized a national effort. Volunteers who had never met the Smith family joined the search. Donations arrived from across the country. For 9 days, the public believed her. The media treated her as a victim. Law enforcement allocated massive resources to the search she had initiated, and every single day of those 9 days, Susan Smith stood in front of cameras and lied to the faces of people who had given up their time, their money, and their sleep to help find children who were already dead. Detectives found problems almost immediately. The traffic light where Susan claims the carjacking occurred operated on a sensor system. It would not have turned red without another vehicle present to trigger it. No other vehicle was documented at that location at the time she described. Her own account placed her at a light that should not have been red. Witnesses at a Walmart where she claimed to have been with the boys before the carjacking did not recall seeing her. As days passed, investigators found no fingerprints, no vehicle sightings, and no witnesses supporting the existence of the carjacker she described. The skepticism grew. By November 3, 1994, detectives confronted Susan directly. Under the weight of accumulated contradictions and forensic evidence pointing to the car's location, she confessed. On November 3, 1994, after 9 days of sustained deception, detectives confronted Susan Smith directly. They had compiled enough contradictions, the traffic light, the absence of witnesses, the failed polygraph indicators, to challenge her story with confidence. The interview lasted hours. When it ended, Susan Smith was no longer a victim, she was a confessor. The absence of any supporting evidence for the carjacking, no fingerprints on the vehicle, no witnesses, no surveillance footage, combined with the traffic light problem to create a picture that increasingly pointed in one direction. Investigators began shifting their focus from the search for an unknown suspect to the woman sitting across from them in the interview room. There was no carjacker. Susan had driven her Mazda protégé to the shore of John D. Long Lake with Michael and Alexander strapped into their car seats. She released the parking brake. The car rolled down the boat ramp and into the water. Both boys lost their lives, restrained in their seats, while the car sank. Police divers located the vehicle at the bottom of the lake. Both children were found inside, still buckled in. Divers found the car at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Both boys were still inside, strapped into their seats. The water at the ramp was deep enough that the car had sunk completely. From the shore, nothing was visible. Susan had chosen a location where the evidence would disappear, and for 9 days, it did. The psychological endurance required to maintain the deception for 9 consecutive days became a subject of analysis in criminal psychology for years afterward. Smith was not hiding from investigators, she was facing them daily. She sat for formal interviews, she answered detailed questions about the carjacking that had never happened. She described the alleged suspect's appearance, his clothing, his behaviour. She produced these details consistently, under pressure, while police officers who were growing increasingly sceptical watched her for signs of deception. The fact that she sustained the performance for as long as she did, while an entire community poured its energy into a search she knew was futile, remains one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Susan Smith's trial took place in July 1995. The prosecution argued she ended her children's lives to pursue a relationship with a man who did not want kids. The defence, led by Judy Clark and David Brooke, presented evidence of severe depression and childhood trauma. After 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty of 2 counts. She was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years. The jury rejected the death penalty. The sentencing outcome reflected the tension between the severity of the crime and the factors presented in Smith's defence. The jury accepted that Smith was guilty, but stopped short of the maximum penalty. The defence had presented a portrait of a young woman with a deeply troubled personal history, including childhood trauma, depression, and emotional instability. And those factors, while insufficient to produce a not guilty verdict, were enough to convince the jury that life imprisonment, rather than death, was the appropriate sentence. Judy Clark, one of the defence attorneys, would go on to represent other high-profile defendants in capital cases. Her work on the Smith trial demonstrated a specific approach, acknowledging the horror of the crime while presenting the human circumstances that surrounded it. The jury's decision to reject the death penalty and impose life imprisonment reflected the effectiveness of that approach and the complexity of the case. Smith became eligible for parole in 2024. The board denied her release unanimously. She remains in prison at Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. Her false accusation of a black carjacker drew intense national criticism for inflaming racial tensions and directing suspicion toward innocent people. Michael was 3 years old. Alexander was 14 months old. They had no idea what their mother was planning, and they had no way to stop it. The boat ramp at John D. Long Lake still slopes down to the water. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. Susan Smith's lies lasted 9 days before detectives broke her, but the next suspect spent years appearing on national television with a smirk on his face, because he was a cop who thought he knew exactly how to beat the system. Case 4. Drew Peterson. Kathleen Savio married Drew Peterson on May 3, 1992. He was a police sergeant in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, and he had been on the force for decades. They had 2 sons together. The marriage, by all documented accounts, was not a peaceful one. Records show police were called to their home on multiple occasions. The conflict was sustained and escalating. Their divorce was finalized in October 2003. 5 months later, on March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found dead. Her body was found in a dry bathtub at her home. She had a gash on her scalp and bruising on her body. Despite these findings, the coroner ruled it an accidental death. No charges were filed. The case was closed. Drew Peterson had already moved on. He had married his 4th wife, Stacey Cales, in October 2003, while still married to Savio. 3 years later, Stacey would disappear. Her body has never been found. The injuries were noted in the initial report, but not investigated further. The combination of a head wound and bruising on the body of a woman found in a bathtub should have raised questions. It did not, at least not enough to change the ruling. That failure of initial examination would haunt the case for years. It took the vanishing of a 4th wife to force investigators to reopen the death of the 3rd, and what they found when they looked again changed everything. Drew Peterson's background in law enforcement made him unique among the suspects in this series. He understood how evidence was collected. He knew how interrogations worked. He had spent decades inside the system that was now, slowly, turning its attention toward him. That knowledge gave him tools most suspects did not have, and it may have given him a confidence that, over time, became indistinguishable from arrogance. Peterson had been married 4 times. His 3rd marriage to Savio produced 2 sons and a documented history of domestic conflict that included multiple police calls. But despite the pattern, no criminal charges were filed during the marriage. When Savio was found dead in 2004, the system Peterson had spent his career working within accepted the initial finding of accidental death. It took 3 years and the vanishing of another woman to force anyone to look again. Drew Peterson's position as a police sergeant gave him an understanding of investigative procedures that most suspects did not have. He knew how evidence was collected, how witnesses were evaluated, and how cases were built. This knowledge influenced his behaviour during the years between Savio's death and his arrest, including the public media appearances that characterised the later stages of the investigation. His demeanour on camera suggested not just innocence, but invulnerability, as though his career in law enforcement had convinced him that the system could not touch him. Stacey had confided in multiple people about her fears. She told a pastor that she had information about Kathleen Savio's death that frightened her. She told friends she was afraid of what Drew might do. The combination of these pre-disappearance statements, the absence of financial activity, the silenced phone, the lack of contact with anyone, created a profile inconsistent with voluntary departure. Investigators treated her case as a probable homicide from the beginning, even though the absence of a body prevented formal charges. The connection between Stacey's disappearance and the reopening of Savio's case was direct. Investigators recognized that a pattern involving 2 wives could not be coincidence. One dead under suspicious circumstances, one vanished. Both had described fear of their husband. Both had told people Drew Peterson was dangerous. The convergence created investigative momentum that had not existed when either case was examined in isolation. When Stacey vanished, it forced investigators to do something they should have done 3 years earlier: dig up Kathleen Savio's body and look again. In late 2007, authorities dug up Kathleen Savio's body. A new forensic review, conducted by pathologists who had not been involved in the original examination, reached a different conclusion. The cause of death was changed, as drowning classified as a homicide, with physical evidence of a struggle. The bruising and trauma that had been dismissed in 2004 were now interpreted as signs that Savio had been killed. The original accidental classification was overturned. On May 7, 2009, a Will County grand jury formally charged Drew Peterson for the first-degree killing of Kathleen Savio. Bail was set at $20 million. The case was built without a single piece of direct physical evidence linking Peterson to Savio's death. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon. The prosecution rested entirely on people who had heard Savio and Stacey describe their fear of Drew, and on forensic experts who looked at Savio's injuries a second time and reached a different conclusion than the one that had closed the case years earlier. Between 2007 and 2009, Drew Peterson did something unusual for a suspect facing scrutiny in 2 potential homicide cases. He sought the cameras rather than avoiding them. He appeared on CNN's Larry King Live. He gave radio interviews. He repeated his innocence claim and his story that Laci had left voluntarily. Unlike suspects who limited their exposure to a single, carefully managed statement, Peterson engaged with the press over and over. Most suspects, even those who maintain their innocence, limit their public exposure to carefully managed statements reviewed by attorneys. Peterson did the opposite. He engaged with reporters freely, sometimes joking with them. He treated the media as an audience to be entertained, rather than a force to be managed. The approach was unusual enough that legal analysts debated whether it reflected a deliberate strategy or a personality that could not resist the attention. What set his appearances apart was his demeanour. He did not project grief. He did not appear concerned. He came across as calm, dismissive, and at times amused by the questions being asked. His tone suggested that the accusations were not worth serious consideration. This attitude generated significant public backlash. Viewers noticed the disconnect between the gravity of the allegations, 2 wives, 1 dead, 1 missing, and the casual indifference of the man at the centre of both cases. Peterson's media strategy produced the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of generating sympathy or establishing credibility, his appearances intensified scrutiny. His dismissive demeanour on camera did not make him look innocent. It made him look like a man who believed the system he had worked in for decades would protect him. The period between 2007 and 2009 was never seen before for a suspect. Peterson had not been charged. He was a free man who chose repeatedly to appear on national television, discussing 2 cases in which he was the primary person of interest. The volume of his media appearances and the consistent arrogance of his demeanour made him one of the most recognisable suspects in the country before a single charge was filed. When the formal charges came in May 2009, the public had already spent 2 years watching Peterson on camera and forming conclusions about his guilt. During one appearance on Larry King Live, Peterson was asked directly about Laci's disappearance. His answers were evasive, but delivered with a confidence that viewers found jarring. He smiled at moments when the subject matter called for gravity. He deflected questions with a casualness that seemed designed to minimise the seriousness of what was being discussed. Legal commentators noted that his behaviour on camera was unlike anything they had seen from a person under active investigation for 2 potential homicides. Prosecutors faced a fundamental problem. Both women who could have testified about Drew Peterson's behaviour were unavailable. Kathleen Savio was dead. Laci Peterson was missing. But both had made statements before they died or disappeared to friends, clergy and attorneys, describing their fear of Drew and his violent behaviour. This challenge led Illinois to pass what became known as Drew's Law, a law permitting certain statements by unavailable witnesses to be admitted as evidence. The law was controversial, but it addressed a specific gap: the ability of suspects to silence the very people whose testimony could convict them. Witnesses also testified that Peterson had expressed threats against Savio and had attempted to solicit someone to kill her. The law was literally rewritten because of Drew Peterson, and the statements it allowed into evidence were the foundation that convicted him. The passage of Drew's Law represented a rare moment in which a single criminal case directly changed the legal framework of an entire state. Legislators recognized that existing rules of evidence created a gap suspects could exploit: silence a witness permanently, and their testimony disappears with them. The new law closed that gap and sent a message beyond Peterson's case. The legal system would find a way to hear from victims, even when the suspect had ensured they could no longer speak for themselves. When the case finally reached a courtroom in 2012, approximately 70 witnesses testified over several weeks. On September 6, 2012, the jury returned a guilty verdict for the killing of Kathleen Savio. Peterson was sentenced to 38 years. The conviction was upheld by the Illinois Supreme Court in 2017. While in prison, Peterson was convicted in 2016 of attempting to arrange a hit on the prosecutor, Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow. He received an additional 40 years. He is now serving a combined 78-year sentence. The legal journey from Savio's death in 2004 to Peterson's final sentencing in 2016 spanned more than a decade. It involved an initial misclassification of the cause of death, a second wife's disappearance, a body being dug up and re-examined, a new state law being passed, and a trial built entirely on testimony from people who relayed what two women had said before one died and the other vanished. No other case in this series required the legal system to change its own rules in order to reach a verdict. The attempt to arrange a hit conviction added a dimension without precedent in the other cases in this series. A man already convicted of killing his third wife attempted, from inside a prison cell, to arrange the assassination of the prosecutor who put him there. The audacity of the scheme, and the fact that it was detected and prosecuted, underscored the degree to which Peterson believed he could manipulate the people and systems around him, even from time in prison. Glasgow, the prosecutor Peterson tried to have eliminated, later described the moment he learned about the plot. He had spent years building a case against a former police officer and had succeeded in securing a conviction that many thought was impossible. The fact that Peterson's response was not acceptance, but attempted retaliation, confirmed, in Glasgow's view, the character of the man he had prosecuted, someone who believed that the rules applied to everyone except himself. Stacey Peterson has never been found. Drew Peterson will die in prison. The two women who could have told the full story of what he did never got that chance. One was discovered lifeless in her own bathroom. The other walked out of her house one October morning and vanished forever. The case remains open in one respect. No one knows where Stacey is. Her family continues to seek information about her remains. The reward for information has remained active for years. For Peterson, already serving 78 years, the legal consequences are settled. For Stacey's loved ones, the absence of a body means there is no grave to visit, no closure to reach, and no finality to accept. Make sure to subscribe before the next case. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. Drew Peterson kept his mouth shut when it mattered most, but the next killer did the exact opposite. She gave jailhouse interviews to 2 national television programs and handed prosecutors everything they needed to convict her. Case 5. Jodi Arias. In September 2006, Jodi Arias met Travis Alexander at a professional conference in Las Vegas. Alexander was a motivational speaker and salesman from Mesa, Arizona. He was 30 years old, devoutly Mormon, and active in his church community. Arias was 26, working a series of jobs that included photography and waitressing. She converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints the same year they met. Their relationship began shortly after the conference and lasted, in various forms, for nearly 2 years. Friends described it as intense, volatile, and defined by a cycle of breakups and reconciliations that neither seemed able to end. The conference was for Prepaid Legal Services, a company where Alexander had built a reputation as a top earner and a charismatic public speaker. Arias was newer to the organization and less established. The dynamic between them, he was successful and socially connected, she was less anchored and increasingly focused on him, would become relevant to the prosecution's argument about obsession, control, and the psychological trajectory that led to June 4, 2008. Travis Alexander was a salesman and motivational speaker who had built a life around ambition, faith, and community. He owned a home in Mesa. He had a wide circle of friends. He was active in his church. The contrast between his public persona and the intensity of his private relationship with Arias became a recurring element at trial. But before the crime, his life was defined by forward momentum. He was planning trips. He was building his business. He was 30 years old. He had recently returned from a work trip and was preparing for an upcoming vacation to Cancun with friends. The trip was planned. The tickets were booked. The people who would have gone with him were expecting to see him at the airport. He never made it. On June 4, 2008, Travis Alexander was killed inside his home in Mesa, Arizona. He was found in his bathroom shower. He had been wounded 27 times. He suffered a fatal neck wound. He had been shot once in the face. Jodi Arias would later tell 3 completely different stories about what happened that day, and every single one of them was contradicted by the physical evidence she left behind. The evidence that would convict her was hiding on a digital camera she tried to destroy. in a bloody palm print she left on the wall, and in photographs that captured the final minutes of Travis Alexander's life. Arias and Alexander officially began dating in February 2007. The relationship was complicated by the tension between Alexander's religious commitments and the physical nature of their relationship. He was a public figure within his church. The conflict between his spiritual values and his private life became a theme that would recur throughout the trial. They broke up on June 29, 2007, but the end of the formal relationship did not end contact. They continued to see each other, communicate, and cycle back toward each other over the following year. People close to Alexander would later describe his growing unease about Arias after the breakup. The ongoing connection, neither fully together nor fully apart, created a dynamic that prosecutors characterized as obsessive on Arias's part. In early June 2008, Arias made a series of preparations for a trip to Arizona that would later be presented as evidence of planning. The car rental was obtained in Redding, California, not near Arias's home, which raised questions about whether she was trying to avoid being tracked. She also reportedly borrowed gas cans to avoid using gas station cameras along the route to Arizona. Prosecutors presented these steps as evidence of a planned plan to travel to Alexander's home, kill him, and return without creating a traceable trail. The defense would later argue self-defense. The preparations told a different story. Photographs that had been deleted from Alexander's digital camera were recovered through forensic analysis. The images placed Arias inside the home on the day of the killing. Some were taken minutes before the attack, others captured images during and after it. Arias had tried to destroy the camera, washing it and attempting to eliminate the data. The memory card survived. A bloody palm print matching her DNA was found on the bathroom wall. Her hair was recovered at the scene. What made Jodi Arias' case unique in this series was not how she killed Travis Alexander, it was what she did after, when she sat in front of cameras and declared with absolute confidence that no jury would ever convict her. On September 24, 2008, while in jail awaiting trial, Arias gave a televised interview to Inside Edition. She said she was innocent. She said no jury would convict her. The statement was delivered with certainty that struck observers as disconnected from the mountain of physical evidence already assembled against her. That interview was later played in court. In 2009, she gave a longer interview to 48 Hours, again from jail. During this interview, she offered multiple versions of what happened on June 4th. In one account, unknown intruders had broken in and attacked Alexander. In another, she shifted to self-defense. The fact that she provided contradictory stories during a recorded, voluntary interview gave prosecutors exactly what they needed. Documented evidence of a narrative that changed with every telling. The 48 Hours footage was entered as evidence at trial. Reportedly, the first time material from that program was used in a death penalty case. The willingness to sit for recorded interviews, from jail, on camera, without legal counsel advising restraint, set Arias apart from nearly every other suspect in this series. Most defendants are counseled to say nothing before trial. Arias sought the spotlight. She volunteered statements that became prosecution exhibits. The combination of the jailhouse interviews and the trial testimony created a thorough record of Arias's credibility, or lack thereof. From her initial denial of being at the scene, to the fabricated intruder story, to the self-defense claim, to the courtroom testimony where she admitted killing Alexander, the progression was a documented study in narrative collapse. Every version she offered was contradicted by physical evidence. Every story she told was replaced by a new one when the previous version became impossible to defend. The jury heard all of it. Arias's statements to investigators shifted 3 times. First, she denied being at Alexander's home at all. Then, she claimed intruders had broken in. Finally, she said she took his life in self-defense. Each version was abandoned when the physical evidence made it impossible to defend. The progression from denial to fabrication to partial admission demonstrated, in the prosecution's view, not confusion or trauma, but a deliberate process of adaptation. She was not remembering, she was calculating. The physical evidence told a story her words could not override. A bloody palm print, DNA on the bathroom wall, photographs from a camera she tried to destroy that showed Alexander alive in the shower, minutes before the attack, and captured images during and after the violence. The timestamps provided a minute-by-minute timeline of the killing. The memory card survived Arias's attempt to wash the camera. The deleted files were recoverable through forensic imaging. Every piece of evidence she tried to eliminate came back. The defense argued self-defense, describing a violent relationship in which Alexander was the aggressor. But 27 wounds, a wound to the head, and the severity of the neck injury were not consistent with someone defending themselves in a moment of fear. The prolonged nature of the attack pointed to something far more deliberate, and the jury agreed. The case influenced discussions about the ethics of pre-trial media coverage, the allowing into court of jailhouse interviews, and the risks that suspects face when they speak publicly before their cases are tried. Arias's voluntary interviews, given without legal counsel present, recorded on camera, and later entered as evidence, became a cautionary example cited by defense attorneys for years afterward. The lesson was specific and practical. Anything said on camera becomes permanent evidence that cannot be retracted, reframed, or explained away once it has been broadcast and archived. The proceedings stretched nearly 5 months, an extraordinary duration that kept the case in the news cycle longer than almost any criminal trial in Arizona history. Cable news networks covered it daily. The combination of graphic evidence, explicit relationship testimony, Arias's decision to take the stand, and the contradictions between her courtroom statements and her prior accounts created a media phenomenon that dominated headlines for months. Jodi Arias remains in prison in the Arizona Department of Corrections. She has no possibility of parole. The Inside Edition interview, in which she told a national audience that no jury would convict her, has been viewed millions of times and is now used as a teaching example in media ethics and criminal justice courses. The confidence she displayed on camera became the most ironic moment in a case defined by irony. A woman who believed she was too smart to be convicted, providing the evidence that helped ensure she was. The Arias case remains one of the most referenced examples of the dangers of voluntary public statements by criminal suspects. Defense attorneys across the country cite her jailhouse interviews as a textbook illustration of why clients should be counseled to remain silent before trial. Every word Arias spoke on camera, every confident assertion of innocence, every shifting version of events, every claim that contradicted the physical evidence became a tool for the prosecution. She gave them everything they needed, delivered voluntarily, on the record, preserved forever. Travis Alexander's friends established a foundation in his name after the trial. His memory has been kept alive through the community he built during his career and through the public advocacy of the people who knew him. The trial, with its graphic evidence, its daily media coverage, and its sensational elements, sometimes threatened to reduce Travis to a character in someone else's story. His friends and family have worked to ensure that he is remembered as a person, not as a case file. A man with plans, relationships, and a future that was violently taken from him at 30 years old. The foundation supports causes Alexander cared about during his lifetime. For his friends, it represents an attempt to ensure that the public narrative of the case does not reduce Travis to a victim. He was a person first, with ambitions, friendships, and a future that was taken from him. The foundation is their way of insisting that what he built matters as much as what was done to him. The trial began January 2nd, 2013, and became one of the most watched criminal proceedings in cable news history. Arias took the stand, a decision legal analysts described as extraordinary and risky. She admitted killing Travis Alexander, but insisted it was self-defense. The prosecution's cross-examination lasted days, walking her through every contradiction. 27 wounds, a gunshot, and a fatal neck wound were not consistent with a person acting in momentary self-defense. On May 8, 2013, the jury found Jodi Arias guilty of first degree. The penalty phase produced 2 mistrials on the death penalty. On April 13, 2015, she was sentenced to life without parole. Travis Alexander's family sat through every day of testimony. They listened to graphic details about the relationship, about the crime, and about the defense's characterization of their brother as an aggressor. For 5 months, they endured a trial that required them to hear their brother's most private moments discussed in open court and broadcast to millions. The emotional cost of that endurance was described in their victim impact statements as immeasurable. Before the crime, Travis's friends described him as outgoing, driven, and generous. He hosted barbecues. He mentored younger members of his church. He had recently booked a trip to Cancun with friends, a trip he would never take. The life that ended on June 4, 2008, was not standing still. It was accelerating. Plans were being made, relationships were being built, a career was gaining momentum. All of it stopped in a bathroom in Mesa, Arizona. The relationship between Travis and Jodi, as reconstructed through text messages, emails, and witness testimony, was defined by intensity and instability. Friends described arguments that ended in tearful reconciliations, separations that lasted only weeks before contact resumed, and a dynamic that neither person seemed able to end definitively. But beneath the volatility was an imbalance that would prove fatal. Travis was trying to move on, Jodi was not. The relationship was ending on his terms, not hers, and prosecutors argued that this loss of control was what drove her to the violence of June 4th. If these stories are helping you understand the darker side of human nature, subscribe to see more cases we uncover. Jodi Arias changed her story 3 times and still got convicted. But the next case involves a mother who lied about everything for 31 days and walked out of the courtroom a free woman. Case 6. Casey Anthony. On June 16, 2008, 2-year-old Kaylee Marie Anthony was last seen alive. She lived in Orlando, Florida, with her mother Casey and her grandparents George and Cindy Anthony. Kaylee was the center of the household, the child around whom daily routines, family plans, and holiday traditions revolved. She was 2 years old. Casey was 22, living with her parents, and not consistently employed, though she told friends stories about jobs she did not have. Cindy and George Anthony helped raise Kaylee. The household was defined by the presence of the child. Kaylee was learning nursery rhymes. She had a vocabulary that was growing every week. She had grandparents who built their schedules around her. The family dynamics between Casey and Cindy were tense, frequent arguments over parenting, finances, and Casey's personal choices. But from the outside, the house on Hope Spring Drive was a home held together by a 2-year-old girl. Casey Anthony had no prior violent criminal history. The pattern of deception that defined her behavior, the fabricated jobs, the invented nanny, the elaborate lies maintained across weeks, was documented and extensive, but none of it had previously resulted in harm to another person. What changed in June 2008, and why it changed, remained the central unanswered question of the case. The prosecution argued a planned act. The defense argued accidental death. The jury had to decide which version was true without definitive proof of either. Casey Anthony did not report her daughter missing. Not that day, not that week, not that month. 31 days passed before anyone outside the Anthony home learned that Kaylee was gone, and when the truth finally surfaced, it was not Casey who raised the alarm. It was her mother, Cindy, who called 911 and told the operator that her daughter's car smelled like a dead body. For 31 days, Casey Anthony told friends and family that Kaylee was fine, safe with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. The nanny did not exist. What is documented is the 31-day gap. During those weeks, Casey told friends Kaylee was with a nanny. She provided details about this person, her schedule, her location, her relationship with Kaylee. Police later determined that Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez did not exist. There was no nanny. There was no arrangement. The entire story was fabricated from the ground up. During those same 31 days, Casey attended parties, went to social events, and showed no visible signs of distress. The 31-day gap was never seen before in a high-profile child disappearance case. In most cases involving missing children, parents contact police within hours. Casey waited more than 4 weeks. During that period, she constructed and maintained detailed fictions about Kaylee's whereabouts across multiple conversations with multiple people. She described the nanny's schedule, her apartment, her relationship with Kaylee, all fabricated. The sustained nature of the deception, consistently maintained for 31 days, was itself significant prosecution evidence, demonstrating a capacity for lying that the state argued was consistent with the deliberate concealment of a crime. The behaviour during those 31 days became one of the most analysed periods of conduct in modern criminal case history. Photographs from Casey's social media during this period showed her at parties, at bars, smiling and posing with friends. She got a tattoo that read, "Bella Vita," beautiful life, during the weeks her daughter was missing. Prosecutors argued the tattoo was evidence of a woman who had deliberately freed herself from the responsibilities of parenthood and was celebrating that freedom. The defense argued it had no connection to Kaylee's death. The tattoo became one of the most cited details of the case, a permanent mark that seemed to celebrate a new beginning at a time when her daughter was gone. Prosecutors pointed to it as the action of a mother who had freed herself from responsibility and was enjoying the result. The defense argued it had personal meaning unrelated to Kaylee. The jury heard both sides. On July 15, 2008, Cindy Anthony called 911. She reported Kaylee missing and described a smell in Casey's car that she compared to the presence of remains. The next day, Casey was arrested for child neglect and making false statements. Kaylee's remains were not found until December 11, 2008, in a wooded area near the Anthony family home. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide, but could not determine the precise mechanism due to the condition of the remains. That inability to establish exactly how Kaylee died would become the single most consequential gap in the prosecution's case. Casey did not deliver the kind of extended televised plea seen in other cases. Her exposure came through other channels: jailhouse phone calls broadcast to millions, recorded police interviews, and her parents' televised appeals for Kaylee's safe return in July 2008. George and Cindy Anthony appeared on camera repeatedly, emotional and direct. Casey's recorded jail calls, in which she displayed irritation rather than grief, were played on cable news networks and shaped public perception of her guilt long before the trial began. The jailhouse phone calls, however, came some of the most analysed recordings in the case. In conversations with her family, Casey displayed frustration and irritation rather than concern for Kaylee. She complained about media coverage. She focused on her own situation rather than her daughter's absence. The recordings were played on cable news and shaped the public's perception of Casey as a mother who was more concerned with herself than with her missing child, an impression that persisted through the trial and beyond. The trial began May 24, 2011, lasted 6 weeks, and was televised in its entirety. The prosecution presented forensic evidence from Casey's vehicle, internet searches, including queries for chloroform, duct tape found near Kaylee's skull, and the thorough pattern of lying that characterised Casey's behaviour. The defence, led by Jose Baez, offered a theory that shocked the courtroom. Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family pool on June 16th, and George Anthony had helped Casey conceal the death. The defence presented no physical evidence supporting this theory. On July 5, 2011, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty of first degree, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, guilty on 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. Casey Anthony was sentenced to 4 years. Due to time served, she was released on July 17, 2011, 12 days after the verdict. The release created scenes of public outrage outside the Orange County Jail. Crowds gathered to express anger. Death threats were reported. Casey was forced into seclusion for years following the not guilty verdict. The intensity of the public response highlighted the gap between the legal process and public sentiment, a gap this case exposed more vividly than perhaps any trial since 1995. The public reaction revealed something deeper than disagreement with a legal outcome. It exposed the tension between 2 systems operating by different rules, the court of public opinion and the court of law. In the first, Casey Anthony was guilty the moment the 31-day gap became public. In the second, the jury needed proof of how Kaylee died, and the prosecution could not provide it. Both systems functioned as designed. The results were impossible to reconcile. The not guilty verdict triggered one of the most sustained public backlashes against a jury verdict in modern American legal history. Polling after the trial showed an overwhelming majority of Americans believed Casey Anthony was guilty. The gap between public certainty and the legal outcome raised questions that extended beyond this single case, about the burden of proof, about the limits of indirect evidence, and about the difference between what people believe to be true and what 12 jurors can conclude beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution had proven that Casey lied about everything for 31 days. They could not prove, with the precision the law requires, exactly how her 2-year-old daughter died. Caylee Anthony was 2 years old. She had a grandmother who loved her enough to call 911 the moment she learned the truth. She had a mother who waited 31 days to say anything at all. The nursery rhymes Caylee was learning to sing, the birthday parties that were being planned, the first day of school that was still years away. None of it happened. Casey Anthony lives in Florida. In 2022, she participated in a Peacock documentary denying the killing. Caylee's remains were found in the woods, less than a quarter mile from the house where she had lived. The case influenced how prosecutors in other jurisdictions approached indirect evidence. The lesson of the Anthony trial was specific and practical. Without a definitive cause of death, a first-degree conviction is extraordinarily difficult to obtain, regardless of how compelling the surrounding evidence may be. The indirect case against Casey Anthony was among the strongest ever presented to a jury, and it was not enough. The Anthony case remains one of the most debated verdicts in American legal history, a case where the evidence of deception was overwhelming, but the evidence of a deliberate act, as defined by the legal standard, was insufficient. It forced a national conversation about what justice means when the system produces an outcome that the majority of the public considers wrong. Whether the jury was right or wrong is a question that has no definitive answer. What is definitive is that Caylee Anthony is dead, that her mother lied about it for 31 days, and that no one has ever been held legally accountable for how she died. George and Cindy Anthony, who had raised Caylee alongside Casey, were left to navigate the aftermath of a verdict that satisfied no one. They had lost their granddaughter, they had watched their daughter stand trial, and the legal system had returned a result that left the central question of the case: what happened to Caylee on June 16, 2008, officially unanswered. The family's grief was compounded by the public nature of the proceedings and by the continued media attention that followed Casey's release. In the years since the trial, the Anthony case has been cited in legal scholarship, media analysis, and public discourse as a defining example of how the American justice system functions and how it can produce outcomes that satisfy no one. The prosecution presented the strongest indirect case available. The defense offered an alternative theory without evidence to support it, and 12 jurors, applying the standard the Constitution requires, returned a verdict that the majority of the country could not accept. The medical examiner's inability to determine the cause of Caylee's death was not a failure of forensic science. It was a consequence of the 31-day delay and the conditions in which the remains were found. Environmental exposure in the Florida heat had advanced to a point where the specific mechanism of death could not be determined. Had the body been recovered sooner, had Casey reported her daughter missing when it happened rather than 31 days later, the forensic picture might have been different. The delay that defined Casey's behaviour also defined the prosecution's challenge. The lies she told for 31 days did not just conceal the crime, they may have made it legally unprovable. Florida's climate accelerated the process. The heat, the humidity, and the exposure to the elements meant that by the time Caylee's remains were recovered in December 2008, 6 months after she was last seen, the forensic picture was severely limited. The duct tape found near the skull was the strongest physical evidence the prosecution had, but duct tape alone, without a clear mechanism of death, was not enough to prove how a 2-year-old child had died. The delay Casey created did not just hide the truth, it may have made the truth legally impossible to establish. The distance between what the public believed and what the law could prove defined the Anthony case more than any other element. It was a case built on lies, 31 days of them, but the lies alone could not establish how a 2-year-old girl died. And without that answer, the legal system could not deliver the outcome that the vast majority of the country expected. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. Casey Anthony's case was resolved in 3 years, but the next father spent nearly a decade making televised pleas for his missing son, while investigators slowly built a case that would take 9 years to reach a courtroom. Case 7, Mark Redwine. In November 2012, 12-year-old Dylan Redwine did not want to go to his father's house for Thanksgiving. His parents, Mark Redwine and Elaine Hall, had divorced in 2007, and the custody arrangement required Dylan to make regular visits. He lived with his mother in Colorado Springs. His father lived in Vallecito, a remote rural community in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. Dylan told people he did not want to make the trip. A court order left him no choice. The terrain around Vallecito posed exceptional challenges for search teams. The San Juan Mountains are defined by steep ridgelines, dense forest cover, and access roads that become impassable in winter. Snow buried potential evidence within weeks of Dylan's disappearance. Limited cellular coverage in the area meant that the digital evidence investigators would eventually rely on, cell phone tower records, location data, was sparse compared to what would be available in an urban environment. The geographic isolation that made Vallecito a difficult place to search was the same isolation that made it a place where a crime could go unresolved for years. Winter arrived within weeks of Dylan's disappearance. Snow covered potential evidence. Roads that were already limited became impassable. The window for ground-level searching closed before investigators had any indication of where to focus their efforts. When spring came and the snow melted, the landscape had changed. Animal activity, water runoff, and natural erosion had moved or degraded whatever physical evidence might have been left exposed. The length of the investigation tested the limits of public attention and organisational commitment. Cold case investigations require sustained resources, ongoing forensic analysis, and the willingness of prosecutors to bring charges based on evidence that has accumulated over years rather than days. The Redwine case demonstrated that justice in complex investigations does not arrive on a predictable schedule, and that families of victims may endure years of uncertainty before accountability is achieved. The investigation that connected a father's televised pleas to his son's remains scattered across a mountainside took nearly a decade, one of the longest timelines in this series. Court records documented ongoing custody disputes between Mark and Elaine in the years following their divorce. The relationship between father and son was strained. Evidence presented at trial showed the tension had been escalating in the months before the Thanksgiving visit. Prosecutors argued that the specific trigger for the violence was a confrontation. Dylan had discovered embarrassing photographs of his father, and the argument that followed turned fatal. The visit was not a reunion, it was a court-mandated obligation that a 12-year-old boy resisted, and that resistance proved to be justified. The photographs were not described in detail at trial, but their nature was made clear. They depicted Mark Redwine in situations that a 12-year-old boy would find deeply disturbing and shameful. Dylan had found them before the Thanksgiving visit. The prosecution's theory was that Dylan confronted his father about what he had seen, and that Mark's response was violent and fatal. The argument was not planned. The outcome was irreversible. On November 19, 2012, Mark Redwine told investigators that Dylan had left the house early that morning after an argument between them. He said he did not know where his son had gone. Search teams mobilized across La Plata County. The terrain around Vallecito is mountainous, heavily forested, and accessible only by limited roads. Winter conditions compounded the difficulty. The search found nothing. In June 2013, 7 months after Dylan vanished, partial remains were found approximately 10 miles from Mark's home. Forensic analysis confirmed they belonged to Dylan. 2 more years passed before additional remains, including skull fragments, were located in a nearby area in 2015. The cause of death was determined to be a fatal blow. The discovery of remains in 2 separate phases, 2013 and 2015, extended the investigative timeline significantly. The terrain around Vallecito, with its dense forest and steep terrain, made thorough searching nearly impossible during winter months. The fact that animal scavenging had scattered the remains across a wide area meant that each recovery provided only partial evidence. Forensic experts worked with limited material. Despite these challenges, the analysis was conclusive. Dylan had been killed by someone who struck him with significant force, and his body had been deliberately placed in the wilderness. While investigators spent years recovering his son's remains from a mountainside, Mark Redwine went on local television, presenting himself as a father who wanted answers. After reporting Dylan missing, Mark Redwine appeared in multiple televised interviews with Colorado media outlets. he pleaded for Dylan's safe return. He maintained his story that Dylan had left voluntarily after an argument. These appearances occurred while investigators were documenting inconsistencies between his public statements and the evidence they were gathering from his home, from digital records, and from the locations where remains were found. The gap between what Redwine said on camera and what the evidence showed followed a pattern this series has documented again and again. His on-camera appearances followed a pattern seen throughout this series, a family member pleading publicly for information while privately concealing responsibility. Redwine's version held for years because the geographic isolation of Vallecito and the limited early forensic evidence meant there was no immediate contradiction to his account. The lies survived not because they were convincing, but because the environment made them nearly impossible to disprove quickly. The build-up of forensic evidence over nearly a decade created a case that, while indirect, was thorough. Blood inside the home, breakdown of remains indicators detected by trained dogs, cell phone placement data putting mark near the disposal sites, the embarrassing photographs that prosecutors argued triggered the fatal confrontation. Each individual piece might have been challenged in isolation. Taken together, they painted a picture that the jury found persuasive beyond reasonable doubt. The trial itself, in July 2021, lasted several weeks. Prosecutors walked the jury through nearly a decade of investigation, from the initial missing person report, through the recovery of remains in 2013 and 2015, through the forensic analysis, the blood evidence, the cadaver dog alerts, and the cell phone records. The defense countered with challenges to each category of evidence, arguing that no single piece was sufficient to prove guilt. But the prosecution's case was not built on any single piece. It was built on the build-up, and the jury concluded that the combined weight of 9 years of evidence pointed to one person. The verdict arrived on October 22, 2021, 9 years and 11 months after Dylan Redwine was reported missing. For Elaine Hall, it was the end of a campaign that had consumed nearly a decade of her life. She had given interviews, organised vigils, maintained contact with investigators, and kept Dylan's name in the public consciousness during years when the case might otherwise have faded from attention. Her advocacy was not peripheral to the outcome, it was central. The organisational resources that sustained the investigation over 9 years were partly sustained by the public attention she refused to let diminish. The 9-year wait between disappearance and conviction tested every person and institution involved. Investigators retired. New detectives picked up the case files. Forensic technology advanced. Through it all, Dylan's mother kept the pressure on, giving interviews, attending hearings, and refusing to let her son become another unsolved case in a filing cabinet. The Redwine case demonstrated that indirect evidence, accumulated over years and across multiple categories of forensic analysis, can produce a conviction even when no eyewitness testimony exists, when the remains are incomplete, and when the crime occurred in a remote location that made evidence recovery exceptionally difficult. The 9-year timeline tested the patience and resources of every institution involved, but the persistence of investigators, the advocacy of Dylan's mother, and the build-up of evidence over nearly a decade ultimately produced the accountability that seemed, at many points during those years, unlikely to come. Mark Redwine is currently imprisoned in the Colorado Department of Corrections. His 48-year sentence ensures that he will spend the remainder of his natural life in prison. The mountains around Vallecito, where Dylan's remains were scattered across 10 miles of wilderness, are quiet. The custody arrangement that sent a reluctant 12-year-old boy to his father's remote home for Thanksgiving has been examined and re-examined in the years since. The court order was routine. The outcome was anything but. Investigators who started on the case retired before it was resolved. New detectives inherited the files and continued. Forensic technology advanced during the 9 years the case was open. Methods unavailable in 2012 were standard by 2021. The persistence of the people who refused to let the case go cold, investigators, prosecutors, and above all Elaine Hall, was ultimately what carried it across the finish line. The Redwine case illustrated how the isolation of rural environments can extend the timeline of criminal investigations by years. In an urban setting, the evidence that ultimately convicted Mark Redwine, blood traces, cell phone tower records, cadaver dog alerts, might have been gathered within weeks or months. In the mountains of southwestern Colorado, the same evidence took years to compile. Winter conditions buried potential evidence. Limited road access delayed searches. The geographic challenges that defined the investigation also defined Dylan's experience. A 12-year-old boy, far from home, in a place where help was not coming. The defense challenged every element of the prosecution's case. They argued that the blood evidence was insufficient to prove a homicide had occurred inside the home. They questioned the reliability of cadaver dog alerts. They noted the absence of any eyewitness testimony. The case was entirely indirect, built on forensic traces, geographic connections, and the prosecution's theory of motive. But the build-up of those traces, over nearly a decade of investigation, told a story the jury found persuasive. In July 2017, nearly 5 years after Dylan disappeared, Mark Redwine was arrested and charged with second-degree and harm to a child resulting in death. His trial began in July 2021. On October 22, 2021, the jury found him guilty on both counts. On February 11, 2022, he was sentenced to 48 years in Colorado State Prison. Dylan was 12 years old. A court order sent him to Vallecito against his wishes. The investigation that brought his father to account required 9 years, from a missing person report filed on November 19, 2012, to a guilty verdict returned on October 22, 2021. His mother, Elaine Hall, spent those years keeping public pressure on the case, and her persistence was central to the outcome. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Mark Redwine managed to keep his composure on camera for years, but the next suspect's mask shattered in a single moment of live television, producing what may be the most analysed 5 seconds of footage in true crime history. Case 8. Stephen McDaniel. In the summer of 2011, Lauren Giddings had just graduated from Mercer University School of Law in Macon, Georgia. She was 27 years old. She lived in an apartment complex near campus, the same complex where Stephen McDaniel, a fellow Mercer Law graduate, also lived. To the people around them, they were acquaintances, neighbours, former classmates. Lauren was planning her next step. Stephen was planning something else entirely. Lauren had earned her law degree and was preparing for the bar exam. She had applied to jobs. She was looking at apartments in other cities. Her life was defined by forward momentum, the completion of a demanding degree and the beginning of a professional career. She was 27 years old, living independently, and had every reason to believe that the next chapter of her life was about to begin. She had spent 3 years in law school, studying, preparing for exams, building the foundation for a career she had chosen deliberately. Her classmates were moving into clerkships and associate positions across the southeast. Lauren was part of that cohort. She had done the work. She had earned the degree. Everything that came next, the career, the independence, the life she had been working towards since enrolling at Mercer, was weeks away from beginning. Stephen McDaniel, by contrast, had not moved forward. He had completed the same degree, but appeared to be stagnating. What people around him did not know was that his fixation on Lauren Giddings had been intensifying for months. The stalking behaviour that investigators would later uncover, the unauthorised entries, the stolen items, the surveillance, had been escalating in the space between their 2 apartments. The pre-crime behaviour was critical to the prosecution because it established planning ahead. This was not a sudden confrontation or an argument that escalated beyond control. McDaniel had been studying Giddings's movements and accessing her private space repeatedly over an extended period. He had taken items from her apartment. He had observed her routines. The pattern demonstrated deliberate planning by a person who had been preparing for the crime long before the night he committed it. The nature of the stalking behaviour raised questions that extended beyond the criminal case. Giddings had no idea that the man living in a neighbouring apartment had been entering her home, taking her possessions, and monitoring her movements. The people who lived in the same building had not noticed. The organisational structures that might have flagged abnormal behaviour, the university, the apartment management, the local police, had received no reports. McDaniel operated in the space between visibility and detection, and the gap between what he was doing and what anyone around him knew was absolute. Lauren's partial remains were found in a trash bin outside the apartment complex on the same day Stephen McDaniel agreed to a live television interview. He presented himself as a concerned neighbour. Then the reporter told him a body had been found, and what happened next was captured on camera in real time. Lauren Giddings was last seen alive around June 26, 2011. She was found dead in her apartment. Her remains had been moved after death. Evidence indicated they had been stored in McDaniel's apartment before being placed in the outdoor trash bin, where they were discovered on June 30th. DNA evidence, surveillance footage showing McDaniel entering Giddings' apartment the night she disappeared, and computer records all linked him to the crime. 4 days separated Lauren's last contact with anyone and the discovery of her remains. McDaniel spent that time maintaining the appearance of normalcy, going about his daily routine, interacting with other residents as if nothing had changed. The contrast between his outward behaviour and the reality of what he had done was a form of deception that would shatter the moment a reporter said the words he did not expect to hear. The evidence from McDaniel's computer was particularly significant. Investigators found search histories and digital records that demonstrated planning behaviour in the days and weeks before the killing. The computer evidence, combined with the surveillance footage and the physical evidence inside his apartment, created a timeline of escalation that started with surveillance, moved through unauthorised entry and theft, and ended in homicide. Each phase was more invasive than the last, and each phase left a forensic trace that investigators were able to recover. On June 30th, 2011, a reporter from local station WGXA was interviewing residents outside the apartment complex about the discovery. McDaniel stepped forward and agreed to speak on camera. He positioned himself as a concerned neighbour. His tone was cooperative and measured. He answered questions. He appeared calm. Then the reporter told him that a body had been found at the complex. McDaniel froze. His mouth hung open. His eyes locked in a fixed stare. His body became rigid. He stopped blinking. He stopped talking. The silence lasted several seconds, an eternity on live television. The shift from an animated speaking person to a physically locked, non-responsive figure was so abrupt that the reporter noticed it in real time. The footage captured what behavioural analysts later described as the moment a person carrying guilty knowledge is confronted with information that threatens to expose them. This was not a rehearsed reaction. It was not controlled. It was the raw, unfiltered response of a man who believed the body would not be found, learning on live television that it had been. In the broader context of this series, McDaniel's televised appearance is unique. He did not deliver a rehearsed plea. He did not maintain composure. He did not manage the interview. The moment of confrontation produced a visible failure of deception, captured in real time by cameras he had voluntarily agreed to face. Every other suspect in this series controlled their on-camera moments, at least briefly. McDaniel lost control of his in 5 seconds. That footage has since appeared in training programs and psychology courses worldwide. It captures something that cannot be rehearsed or faked. The exact moment active deception becomes unsustainable, recorded in real time by cameras the suspect had voluntarily agreed to face. The interview footage became the defining artifact of the McDaniel case, more cited, more analysed, and more widely shared than any other element of the investigation. In a series of cases defined by televised performances, some sustained for months, some lasting days, McDaniel's 5-second collapse stands alone. It was not a performance at all. It was the involuntary end of one. Stephen McDaniel was arrested on July 1, 2011, one day after the televised interview. On April 21, 2014, he pleaded guilty to the crime to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. No trial was necessary. Lauren Giddings was 27 years old. She had just finished law school. She had a career ahead of her and plans that extended years into the future. None of them survived June 2011. The 5 seconds of footage, the freeze, the stare, the silence, have been viewed millions of times. The closeness between victim and suspect, neighbours in the same apartment complex, graduates of the same law school, added a dimension of violation that extended beyond the crime itself. Lauren Giddings had lived her daily life within yards of the man who was stalking her, entering her apartment, and preparing to kill her. The ordinariness of the setting, a student housing complex, a shared parking lot, the hallways of a law school, made the crime feel closer to everyday life than many of the cases in this series. It was not a crime that required unusual access or elaborate planning. It required only closeness, obsession, and the decision to act. The investigation and prosecution of Stephen McDaniel were resolved with relative speed compared to other cases in this series. The body was discovered on June 30th. McDaniel was arrested on July 1st. The forensic case, built on DNA, surveillance footage, computer records, and physical evidence, was thorough enough that a plea agreement was reached and a trial was never required. The guilty plea, entered on April 21, 2014, ended the legal proceedings but not the analysis. The 5 seconds of footage from the television interview have continued to circulate, study, and discuss in the years since, becoming a permanent artifact of how deception fails under pressure. Lauren Giddings had earned her degree, applied for jobs, and begun planning a professional career that would take her away from Macon and into the next phase of her life. She was 27 years old and moving forward. The man who took her life had been standing still, living in the same apartment complex, fixated on a person who had no idea she was being watched, and preparing for an act of violence that would end her future and define his. The contrast between their trajectories, one ascending, one stagnating, was part of what made the case resonate with the public. Lauren Giddings represented potential. Stephen McDaniel destroyed it. The speed of the forensic investigation, from body discovery to arrest in approximately 24 hours, was enabled by the closeness of the crime to the suspect's residence and the volume of physical evidence that had not been fully concealed. In cases where suspect and victim live in close quarters, the window for evidence recovery is wider and the forensic connections more direct. McDaniel had attempted to clean the scene and destroy evidence, but the DNA, the surveillance footage, and the computer records survived his efforts. The technology that documented Lauren's last days also documented the preparations of the man who ended them. Stephen McDaniel is serving life without parole in the Georgia prison system. The apartment complex where he and Lauren both lived has continued to house law students in the years since. The building looks the same, the hallways look the same, but the people who lived there in the summer of 2011 carry a knowledge that current residents do not, that within those walls, a fixation turned into a plan, and a plan turned into a life taken. The case is now referenced in forensic science education and criminal psychology training as an example of how closeness, obsession, and access can converge in residential settings to produce lethal outcomes. The 5 seconds of television footage, McDaniel's freeze, his locked stare, his stopping of speech, remain the most recognizable visual artifact of the case and one of the most widely studied moments of involuntary behavioral response in modern true crime documentation. The case also prompted renewed attention to campus safety protocols and the screening of residents in student housing complexes. The fact that McDaniel had been entering Giddings' apartment without her knowledge, over a period that may have spanned months, raised questions about the physical security of residential buildings, the monitoring of common spaces, and the responsibility of housing providers to protect their tenants from threats that originate within the building itself. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. Stephen McDaniel froze when he heard the news on camera, but the next killer was so confident in his deception that he volunteered to be interviewed on national television, positioning himself as a helpful witness, while 2 dead children lay hidden just miles from where he stood. Case 10. Ian Huntley. On Sunday, August 4th, 2002, 2 10-year-old girls left their homes in Soham, Cambridgeshire, England. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were wearing matching Manchester United football shirts. They told their families they were walking to the local shop. They never came home. For 13 days, the entire United Kingdom searched for Holly and Jessica. Police helicopters flew over the countryside. Hundreds of officers went door to door. Volunteers from across the region walked footpaths, searched fields, and checked waterways. The story dominated British news, and during the search, one man in Soham went out of his way to appear on television. The school caretaker who told reporters he was one of the last people to see the girls alive. His name was Ian Huntley. He had taken both of their lives. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Both girls' photographs, wearing the matching red shirts, were broadcast across every news channel in the country. The image became one of the most recognised photographs in modern British criminal history. Tips came in from across the United Kingdom. The emotional weight of the story, two young best friends vanishing from a small, safe town, resonated with parents nationwide and generated a level of public engagement that placed enormous pressure on the investigation.
Huntley positioned himself as a witness on national television, while the bodies of two 10-year-old girls lay hidden miles from where he stood. And the system-wide failures that put him in that position would reshape child protection in the United Kingdom forever. Ian Huntley was born on January 31, 1974, in Grimsby, Lincolnshire. At the time of the crime, he worked as a caretaker at Soham Village College. His partner, Maxine Carr, was a teaching assistant at the same school. Huntley had a documented history of prior offence allegations across multiple police jurisdictions, but those allegations had not been prosecuted. Some had been investigated and dropped, others had never been communicated between police forces at all. When Huntley applied for the caretaker position, the background check did not surface his history. The information existed in separate databases, in different jurisdictions, in files that were never cross-referenced. He was cleared for a role that placed him in daily contact with a school community, in a small town where families trusted the people who worked with their children. The failure was system-wide, organisational, and, as the Bishard inquiry would later confirm, entirely preventable. The failure was not a matter of one missed report or one careless administrator. It was system-wide. Multiple police forces had received complaints about Huntley over a period of years. Each force handled its complaints independently. None communicated with the others. When the hiring process for the Soham Village College caretaker position triggered a standard background check, it queried only the databases that were connected to it, which did not include the jurisdictions where Huntley's allegations had been filed. He appeared clean. He was not. The implications of the intelligence failure were staggering. If any one of the police forces that had received complaints about Huntley had communicated with the Cambridgeshire police during the hiring process, his history would have been flagged. The job offer would have been rescinded. He would never have been working at Soham Village College. He would not have been a familiar face in a community that trusted the people associated with their children's school. The chain of events that led to two 10-year-old girls walking past his house on a Sunday afternoon would have been broken at its earliest link. The girls left home that afternoon wearing matching red Manchester United shirts. They walked through Soham on a route they had taken before. The afternoon passed, evening came. They did not return. By nightfall, a major missing person search was underway. The search for Holly and Jessica was one of the largest missing person operations in modern British history. Police helicopters flew over the surrounding countryside. The Royal Air Force provided aerial surveillance. Hundreds of officers conducted house-to-house inquiries. Volunteers from across the region joined organised search parties that combed fields, footpaths and waterways. The intensity of the response reflected both the urgency of two missing children and the close-knit nature of Soham, a town small enough that most families knew each other, and the disappearance of two girls struck at the community's fundamental sense of safety. While the search was still active and hope of finding the girls alive had not been abandoned, Ian Huntley gave televised interviews to the reporters who had descended on Soham. He told cameras he had seen the girls on the afternoon they disappeared. He said they had briefly stopped by his house and then left. He presented himself as a helpful witness, cooperative, concerned, and engaged with the search effort. His claim of being one of the last people to see Holly and Jessica alive accomplished two things simultaneously. In the short term, it positioned him as a credible witness with useful information. In the longer term, once the truth emerged, it became central prosecution evidence. By voluntarily placing himself in direct closeness to the victims at the approximate time of their disappearance, Huntley provided investigators with a connection between himself and the crime, delivered on his own terms and on camera. By placing himself at the centre of the timeline, voluntarily, on camera, without being asked by police, Huntley made a calculation that would define the rest of the case. He believed that positioning himself as a cooperative witness would deflect suspicion. Instead, it anchored investigators' attention on the one person who had placed himself closest to the victims at the time they disappeared. The interview that was meant to protect him
became the statement that helped convict him. He appeared multiple times. His demeanour was calm, his tone measured. Reporters treated him as a community member trying to help. It was only after his arrest that the interviews were replayed in the context of his guilt, and the full scope of the manipulation became apparent. Huntley had used the media to position himself as a witness when he was, in fact, the suspect. Investigators were watching every interview. They noted each detail Huntley volunteered, each moment where he added information that had not been solicited, each instance where his account shifted slightly from the previous version. The interviews that Huntley believed were building his credibility as a witness were, in reality, building the prosecution's timeline. Every word he said on camera was being compared to the forensic evidence accumulating behind the scenes. The case also illustrated the specific risk that arises when a suspect is part of the community affected by the crime. Huntley was not a stranger. He was a known figure, the school caretaker. Parents recognised him. Children recognised him. His presence in the area around the time of the disappearance was unremarkable, because he was supposed to be there. The familiarity that should have been a source of safety instead became the mechanism of access. The girls knew who he was. They had no reason to be afraid. The Soham community had placed its trust in the institutions that served its children: the school, the police, the hiring systems designed to keep dangerous people away from vulnerable populations. That trust was not misplaced in the abstract. The systems were supposed to work, but they failed at a specific, identifiable point. The moment when Ian Huntley's background check returned clean, because the databases that held his history were not connected to the databases being queried. The failure was technical, administrative, and, as the inquiry would confirm, entirely fixable. It was fixed, but it was fixed too late for Holly and Jessica. That trust was earned through decades of reliability. Schools had vetting processes, police maintained records, background checks were standard for positions involving children. The problem was not that safeguards did not exist. The problem was that they operated in silos. Each agency kept its own records independently, and no mechanism connected them. Huntley passed through gaps between databases that never communicated. The trial at the Old Bailey was one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in modern British history. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the fibres, the cleaning efforts, the vehicle evidence, the timeline contradictions, alongside the televised interviews that Huntley had given during the search. The jury watched footage of a man calmly describing his last interaction with two girls he had already killed. The contrast between his on-camera composure and the reality of what he had done was central to the prosecution's case, and devastating in its impact on those who saw it. Huntley's defence attempted to argue that the deaths were accidental, that the girls had come to his house, and that something had gone wrong, but that he had not intended to kill them. The jury rejected this account. The forensic evidence, the concealment of the bodies, the cleaning of the house, and the televised lies all pointed to a deliberate act, followed by a sustained attempt to avoid detection. The whole life tariff imposed by the judge, meaning Huntley will never be considered for release, reflected the severity of the crime, the age of the victims, and the breach of trust that his position in the community represented. The prosecution presented evidence that Huntley had attempted to create an alibi through Maxine Carr, who told police she had been at home with Huntley on the afternoon the girls disappeared. In fact, Carr had been visiting family in Grimsby. Her false statement bought Huntley time during the initial phase of the investigation, time he used to clean the house and dispose of evidence. When her alibi collapsed under scrutiny, it removed the last layer of protection between Huntley and the truth. The families of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman became advocates for the reforms that followed the Bichard inquiry. Their public statements, their participation in the inquiry process, and their sustained engagement with the policy changes that resulted ensured that the organisational failures exposed by the case led to structural reform rather than symbolic gestures. The Disclosure and Barring Service processes millions of background checks annually. The vetting requirements apply to every person seeking to work with children in England and Wales. The system that failed in 2002 was rebuilt, and the architecture of that rebuilt system exists because two families refused to let their daughters' deaths be met with anything less than permanent, system-wide change. Holly and Jessica left their homes on a summer Sunday wearing matching shirts, walking side by side toward a shop at the end of the street. They passed the home of a man their parents trusted because he worked at their school. The walk took minutes. The consequences have lasted decades. The reforms they prompted will protect children who will never know their names. The television footage of Ian Huntley, calm, cooperative, positioning himself as a witness while two dead children lay hidden miles away, is now used in training programs for both law enforcement and media organizations. It is studied as an example of how suspects exploit the assumptions of good faith that underpin press coverage of missing person cases, and as a reminder that the most dangerous person in a community investigation may be the one who appears most eager to help. Soham changed how the United Kingdom protects children, not in theory, but in specific databases, laws, and vetting requirements that now govern who is allowed near young people. What broke in 2002 was rebuilt from the ground up, and two families refused to accept anything less than permanent reform. On August 17th, 13 days after the girls disappeared, their bodies were found near RAF Lakenheath, 10 miles from Soham. Post-mortem examinations confirmed both deaths were homicides. Forensic investigators recovered fibres and trace material linking the girls to Huntley's home. Evidence showed he had attempted extensive cleaning of his residence after the disappearance. His vehicle was forensically linked to the transportation of the bodies. Police identified significant inconsistencies between his televised account and the physical evidence. The Crown Prosecution Service concluded that Huntley had lured the girls into his home and took their lives there. The forensic examination of Huntley's home revealed extensive cleaning, far beyond normal household maintenance. Chemical analysis showed that he had used industrial-strength products on specific surfaces in an attempt to eliminate physical traces of the girls' presence. Despite those efforts, investigators recovered fibre evidence and trace material that placed both children inside the residence. On August 17, 2002, both Huntley and Carr were arrested. Huntley was charged with 2 counts of taking the lives of children. At trial at the Old Bailey on December 17, 2003, the jury found him guilty. He received 2 life sentences with a whole life tariff, meaning he will never be released. Carr was convicted of perverting the course of justice for providing false alibis and was sentenced to 3.5 years. The case triggered the Bitchard inquiry, a formal government investigation into the failures that allowed Huntley to work at a school despite his history. The inquiry found that the information existed in separate police databases that were never cross-referenced. Had the agencies communicated, Huntley would have been flagged and denied the position. The inquiry led to the creation of the Disclosure and Barring Service, centralising background checks for anyone working with children across England and Wales. Holly Wells was 10 years old. Jessica Chapman was 10 years old. They left their houses on a Sunday afternoon to buy sweets. They walked past the home of a man who should never have been allowed to work at their school. The system had the information it needed to stop him. It failed. The reforms that followed their deaths have protected millions of children. But those reforms exist because 2 10-year-old girls, wearing matching football shirts on a summer afternoon, did not come home. If you enjoyed this deep dive into killers who went on live TV before they were caught, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.